Let's go. Here is my story. I, 27 male, have been in a relationship with my girlfriend for 2 years. I'll call her Emma to protect her privacy. I met her at my friend's birthday and instantly got attracted to her. She was incredibly beautiful, but it was her boldness and smartness that got me attracted to her. She had a very interesting personality, and it still amazes me how she was the one who made the move and proposed to me. Our relationship was just like everyone else's, with the same bittersweet moments, and we had fun together. Apart from her fun nature, what intrigued me about her was that she was a strong woman. I mean, she grew up in a very harsh and abusive household. Her parents were almost non-existent. Her father was an addict and even used to hit her and her siblings when drunk. Her mother was too busy and tired with her work to check on her children. Since Emma was the oldest one, she became the motherly figure for her younger siblings. She matured beyond her years. During her early teens, she fled with her younger siblings to a church shelter where she finished her schooling in a community program. Eventually, she became a social worker for children's welfare in Ingo, a role she was still dedicated to when we crossed paths. Her life story struck me deeply. Our time together was positive initially, until she began withdrawing from me. It wasn't an abrupt change. She had always been a bit inconsistent, but over time, her behavior became increasingly unpredictable. She didn't respond to my texts for 2 straight days, and then I had to show up at her place to see what was wrong. She gave some lame excuse and got away with it. When this happened a few times, I confronted her. She had to tell me what's wrong, or else our relationship is not moving anywhere. That's when she told me her whole story about her severe anxiety and depression issues. She said she's been suffering from acute depression ever since she was a teen. And with time, it was getting severe. My heart ached for her, and I encouraged her to move in with me. I had no idea she was battling such deep-seated pain. I believed she was masking her struggles with strength. I vividly recall the intense panic attacks she experienced after relocating to my place. Many nights were spent consoling her and guiding her through those episodes. I did everything in my power to bring her comfort and peace. Although her panic attacks eventually ceased, she still grappled with depression. I suggested she see a therapist, but she hesitated, mentioning a previous unsuccessful experience that had been costly. Determined to help, I searched for a reputable therapist and stumbled upon my roommate's profile, a certified therapist. I reached out to him, explaining Emma's situation, and arranged for the soonest available appointment for her. Despite her worries about the cost and burden on me, I encouraged her to prioritize her healing without concern for finances. Her therapy started, but I could not see any progress even after 3 months. I asked my therapist friend, let's call him Alex, about it, and he said mental healing takes time. He asked me to be patient with her, and I was. But with time, our dynamic started changing. She stopped discussing her problems with me. I mean, she reached out to Alex for everything. Everything means literally everything. Even if it was our relationship. Instead of talking this out with me, she discussed that with Alex. I mean, I understand he was her therapist, but anything that involved me should be discussed with me so that we could solve it together. I was still putting up with all this initially, but when they started meeting each other off therapy sessions and became friends, my insecurity crept in. I kind of felt like a third person in my own relationship. It was not always when they asked me to join them, but once I showed up with them for dinner, they both were so immersed in each other as if I was invisible. I was frustrated, but she looked happy and thought maybe I was overreacting to it all, and she was just trying to heal herself. Once I woke up in the middle of the night to find Emma crying and talking to someone in the living room. I immediately understood it was Alex. I felt so bad, as if my presence was not worthy of her. I was beside her, yet she chose to call Alex in the middle of the night to share her thoughts. When she came back to the bed, she saw that I was awake. I couldn't hold back and asked her what was wrong. She told me it was just an anxiety attack. I asked her why she didn't inform me. She told me that she didn't want to be a burden on me, and talking to Alex helped her better than talking to me. He gave her professional help. I couldn't sleep after hearing that. I could hold back my insecurity because she looked so relaxed and happier with him, but she stayed silent around me. The next day, I told her I felt like a non-existent in her life because she didn't share anything with me. I also confronted her that meeting Alex after therapy was not ideal. I tried to be subtle in my approach so as not to trigger her. I said Alex was my friend and was kind to lend his time at odd hours, but we shouldn't exploit it. She got defensive at this and asked me whether I wanted her to heal or not. She called me a control freak and said I doubted her unnecessarily. After a few minutes, she started hyperventilating, and I got scared. I tried to pacify her, and she shrugged me off, saying not to touch her, else she would kill herself. I seriously got very scared. I left the room and slept in the living room. In the morning, she said she wanted to break and focus on healing and went back to her place. I slept numerous nights with constant fear in my heart that if I ever said anything like that to her again, she would do something horrible. so I decided to keep my thoughts to myself and not overthink the whole situation. I gave her the time she needed to heal. It was more than a month since she had moved out, and I went to Alex to ask him about her progress. When I reached there, I saw him driving off from his clinic with Emma. I felt bitterness in my mouth as they drove off. It felt very suspicious. I called Emma, but she didn't respond to my call. Instead, I got a text from her saying that she couldn't call right now because she was in the church. She lied to me about her meeting with him. I decided to stop being delusional and finally confront her about this. I visited her place. I asked her upfront where was she on the last day, and she said the same thing again. I told her I saw her driving off with Alex. She twisted it, saying Alex is going in the same direction. He offered to drop her at the church. Even before I could say anything, she started threatening me emotionally. Her behavior made me anxious and felt like a jerk in tolerating her. Her anxiety or depression doesn't give you the right to let the other person go through the same trauma. She wasn't trying to protect her peace at this point. She was just avoiding confrontation. Whenever I tried asking her anything, she would just play her victim card and shut me up. I didn't know what to do, so I let her have a break. She almost ghosted me. I again went to meet Alex. I asked him about Emma's progress, and he told me she was doing better than before. I sensed he was cold towards me, as if he wasn't interested in meeting me. His phone started buzzing with M flashing on the screen. He excused himself and went inside. I called Emma, and her phone was busy too. I knew she was on the call with Alex. I was done with the relationship and went for a head-on confrontation with Emma. I told her that their closeness was bothering me a lot. She listened to me quietly at first and then started bashing me, saying that I was jealous, that I failed as a boyfriend, and didn't provide her with comfort. And now that Alex was helping her, I had problems with it. She stood up and started crying like a maniac and told me that if I started to blame her again, she would cut off her wrist and kill herself. I got really scared and tried to calm her down, but she just didn't want to listen to me and asked me to leave. Before going back, I told her that she was just trying to hide behind her problems, and that was not a good thing to do. After leaving her apartment, I literally cried like anything. My anxiety was bottling up inside, and I needed to explode. I called my close friend James and told him the whole thing that happened, and I asked him for his advice. He said that she was literally hiding behind her problems, and I should just let her do her thing for a while. Actually, James referred me to this space to vent out and connect with like-minded people. Looking forward to connecting. If anyone has any suggestions, my condition is quite sensitive, and I want to be careful in handling Emma. 2 things I think. I read about it being unethical in her meeting her therapist after therapy. I'm not even sure that's allowed. You're not supposed to be friends with your therapist. Secondly, it's hard to maintain a relationship when you feel like you're walking on eggshells and constantly living in fear of saying the wrong thing. And then to go and say she'd hurt herself. I'm sorry, Opus, that's a terrible situation to be in and to navigate through. Sounds like she's playing mind games with you in order to keep you in the dark about what's going on with Alex. She needs to deal with whatever it is she's dealing with before her relationship can go any further. This is rough. Update 1. Hello everyone. It's been a while since my last update as I was going through a rough time with Emma and had anxiety throughout the whole break. I listened to James and left Emma on her own for a while before she tried to reach me on her own. After a while, she texted me and asked me if she could come over. I agreed. She came with flowers and hugged me. She looked extremely happy and better. We talked, and she told me about everything that happened on these days and apologized to me for her behavior. I asked her if she was still seeing Alex, and she said that her sessions got shorter and now it's 1 day a week and that she was on medications. I was happy to hear that she was in her healing era. It felt great after a long time. She was soundly asleep, and her phone was continuously buzzing around 2 in the night. It raised my curiosity, and I checked her phone and tried to unlock it, but she had changed her password. I left it as it was and went to sleep. The next morning, I dropped her off at her and go, and I left for her office. During the day, I asked her if she wanted me to pick her up from work. She said she was super busy with work and she would come home a little late, or she may stay at her place. I went back to my place, and after a while, I tried calling her, but she didn't respond and didn't even respond to any of my texts. I waited until midnight and still received no response, so I slept. My messages were still unread in the morning. It scared me to think if she was fine. On the way to my office, I went to her place to see if everything was all right, but the apartment was locked. I called her, and she didn't respond, so I called her friend Sophie to see if she was with her. But she told me she wasn't, and she left the office quite early yesterday. I freaked out. I didn't know what to do or whom to ask, so I headed to work. I was tired of her flakiness, showering love one moment then ignoring me another. I was so drained, and I just wanted to talk to her and ask her what she really wanted from me and from this relationship. But her past reactions had left me traumatized. Neither I was able to leave the relationship nor I was able to fix it. After several hours, she finally called me, and through her voice, she looked pretty fine. I asked her where was she. She told me that she was busy with her new and goes project for child education and she stayed with her friend Sophie the whole night, and that's why she couldn't call me back. I stayed silent, and my heart was pounding pretty badly at her lies. I knew there was something going on, and instead of acting like a fool, it was my time to act. I told her I wanted to meet her, so either she could come over or I'll come. She told me that she was really tired and asked me to come over after finishing off the work. I went to her place. She looked really exhausted and hugged me tightly. While hugging her, I saw a red mark on her neck which looked like a hickey, and I asked where she got that. She told me that she burned herself from the straightener last night. She thought I would believe her, but I didn't because it was nothing like a burn or something else. The entire time we had dinner, she was continuously texting someone. I asked her to keep her phone down at least when we were eating. She told me that it was just a friend and put her phone away. She was on medication and got into a deep sleep. I took her phone and used her fingerprint to unlock it. My hands were shivering while opening her chats. I saw an archive chat, and there were many groups and texts from the website. I almost came to the home screen, but then suddenly caught my eye, and it was no one other than Alex. I opened the text and couldn't believe my eyes. I scrolled back to the first text and started reading it with teary eyes. At first, it was just a patient and therapist chat, but then it turned into a flirt and an emotional connection. She shared every emotional thing with him, and soon they were confessing their love for each other. As per the initial conversation, it was only an emotional connection, and they didn't have a physical relationship. I was shocked to see that eventually, she started faking her problems to gain his sympathy. I couldn't believe she was such an imposter and that she would do something like that. She told him that she needed him very badly and that I was physically and mentally abusing her. Their emotional conversations turned into sexting, and then they discussed having sex. I sat there shivering and felt chills down my body. She also told him that she had broken up with me. Alex also mentioned to her about my visit and told her that he hadn't informed me about anything. Someone with such anxiety and depression was capable of such actions, which was new to me. I was trying to help her, and in return, she ruined me. I checked the gallery and saw their pictures of the dates they went on together. As I was about to get up, her medicine box fell off the table, and all of it got scattered. I was picking them up when I found something suspicious. It was this one pill that had mere stone. The logo on the medicine indicated something related to period. I checked it on Google and found it was an abortion pill. I couldn't take anything further and silently left her without saying anything. She called me in the morning, but I didn't respond. Neither I'm planning to respond to her any longer. I'm just done being the good guy. I think it'd be best to just drop her like a hot potato. She traumatized you into behaving and acting a certain way around her. That's incredibly abusive. I'm so sorry. Opus, she doesn't deserve any more of you. Sure, she may have had anxiety and depression, but she definitely used it against you. Update 2. Finally, Emma left my life, but she left things with me for a lifetime, and that was her anxiety, depression, and panic attacks. I realized that, in the process of helping her heal, I got anxious. Anyway, after finding out the truth, I left her immediately and didn't talk to her at all. I ignored her completely because I didn't have the courage to confront her. I went back to my parents' house and took leave for a few days. I shared everything with my mother, and my physical and mental health both collapsed miserably. My mom advised me to seek closure from her and let everything out because bottling it up would do more damage. I was confused, but then I decided to meet Alex. First, I asked him what was going on between them. He was confused, and then I showed him my prescription that I was diagnosed with depression and I really do need him to tell me everything. I told him I knew all the truth, so there was no point in hiding it anymore. He shared how it all began, convinced that I had mistreated her due to my known anger issues from our college days. I clarified that I never laid a hand on her without her consent and that any form of abuse was simply untrue. My anger problems never emerged when I interacted with her, and I never expected him to betray my trust like this. I revealed that she had been seeing both of us simultaneously. He couldn't fathom that Emma was still involved with me after claiming to have ended things. I presented evidence through romantic texts, leaving him speechless in disbelief. He confessed that he had fallen in love with her and had blindly believed her story. I reminded him that I had recommended my girlfriend to him because I trusted him with her well-being, never anticipating that both of them would deceive me and cause such distress. I asked him not to mention anything about this to her as I still often confronted her. He told me that he wouldn't see her ever again after I showed him the evidence of her double dating. He also told me that she didn't need serious help because whatever she was doing was totally sickening, and you couldn't comprehend whether she was seriously ill or doing it for attention. Her manic episodes were so scary that no one could ever doubt that she was faking it. But I think Alex was right. I think she told me the whole story for attention and did the same with him too. She was even reluctant to seek therapy. And when I urged her to see one, she trapped him too. After my conversation with Alex, I went to Emma's place. The moment she saw me, she hugged me tightly and began crying uncontrollably. She showered me with kisses all over my face, questioning why I'd been ignoring her. Her crying and panicked state seemed almost theatrical, a tactic she'd often used to emotionally sway me. I gently pushed her away and urged her to drop the act and face reality. Confused, she looked at me and asked what I meant. I told her I knew the truth and suggested she pause her performance. She stared at me in disbelief and then started hyperventilating. I sat there while she acted like she was out of breath. She started murmuring that she was having a panic attack. This time I didn't rush to comfort her. I just sat there and gave her a cold stare. She limped her way to the kitchen, trying to fetch water. She was breathing so heavily that I could hear her breath all through the living room. If I had not known the truth, I would have fallen for her acting skill yet again. She brought the glass of water and gulped it all in a shot. Just see her acting. Anyone who is having a panic attack would drink water as soon as they find it and not display an act in front of others. She sat on the couch, trying to pacify herself and giving me a disgusting look. I asked her whether she was done acting and if there was anything left. She told me to mind my language, then started acting like a maniac and threatening me with her life. I stood up and shouted at her to sit properly and stop all this BS. I asked her to confess that she did cheat on my back with Alex and that she was double dating. She sat there in shock and nodded and told me that she got emotionally attached to him. I told her that I didn't care about any BS that she was going to feed me other than the fact that she faked all her anxiety and depression for baseless attention and made a fool out of me. I told her that Alex was now aware of everything about her, and she was free to find someone else to manipulate. As I left, she tried to stop me, but I made it clear that I didn't want her in my life anymore. After that day, I never heard from her again, and it was terrifying. The way she controlled my emotions was awful. I became so deeply attached to her emotionally that I believed all the lies she told me. Alex still checks in on me from time to time. I'm in a better place now, but I've been dealing with severe anxiety. I know it'll take time, but I'm confident I'll be okay eventually. It was never your responsibility to help her or heal her. That was all on her, and now look what her and her lies have done to you. She's totally shattered you. I'm not sure it was entirely worth going to see Alex either. After all he did to you, he was a part of it all. You should totally cut yourself off from Alex too. He doesn't deserve any part of you either. Some things aren't worth the closure. Both of them are. What do you think? That's the story. If you liked it, please support us with a like as well as subscribe to our channel. Write in the comments what you think about the story. Thank you for being here with us.
Subscribe Relation Tales. Michael, don't forget tonight's banquet. Elizabeth called out, her voice tense as she grabbed her coat. Her gaze was sharp, her tone insistent. It's critical for my job. Michael looked up from his coffee, nodding, though his mind was elsewhere. Don't worry, I'll be there. But as the door shut behind her, Michael's expression softened, and he allowed himself a small sigh of relief. He finished his coffee, savoring the peace of an empty house before slipping into his golf attire and grabbing his clubs. Today was set for a round with his old friends, Anthony and Elliot, at their favorite course nearly an hour outside the city. After all, they hadn't had a day like this in years. Hours later, laughter echoed across the lush, manicured fairways as they reminisced over old stories and inside jokes. The autumn sun was warm, the companionship easy. By the time they finished, it was nearing dusk, but Michael's spirits were still high. He'd lost track of time completely. It wasn't until he was pulling into his driveway, well after dark, that the gravity of the evening hit him. The banquet. Elizabeth's banquet. As he stepped into the living room, her voice struck like a slap in the face. I told you this was important. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, fury blazing in her eyes. You knew how much this meant to me, Michael. Michael paused, raising his hands in a placating gesture, trying to make light of the situation. I'm sorry, love. Traffic was terrible. You know how it is? Her expression was unmoved. Funny, I talked to Jeffrey, and he told me you left work hours early. Left your phone right on the kitchen counter. Not even reachable. She took a step closer, her voice rising. So, why don't you tell me the truth for once? Caught, Michael sighed, forcing a faint smile. All right, you got me. I went golfing with Anthony and Elliot. It was just a day with the guys. No big deal. No big deal. Elizabeth repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. "You missed one of the biggest nights of my career for a game of golf?" He tried to laugh it off, but Elizabeth's face was cold, unreadable. She stood for a moment, her jaw tight, before turning on her heel. "You know what? I'm done," she said, her voice steady, but the bitterness cut through. "You can sleep in the guest room. Don't bother talking to me." In the following days, an icy silence settled over the house. Elizabeth threw sharp looks his way and rarely spoke, making her anger crystal clear. Michael, though annoyed by her reaction, brushed it off, focusing instead on work and his own routine. But soon, her behavior shifted. She began staying out late, mumbling vague explanations about work events or drinks with colleagues. Initially, Michael dismissed it. Elizabeth had always been driven and independent. But as the days wore on, her absences became more frequent, her excuses flimsy, and he couldn't shake a growing unease. One night, curiosity got the better of him. After a tense exchange at dinner, he stayed up, pacing the living room until midnight, waiting for her return. When she finally stepped through the door, he noticed her slightly flushed cheeks, her hair tousled, her expression distant. Late night, he asked casually, though his tone was tight. She barely looked at him. "Just drinks with the team," she replied, brushing past him. But her response didn't sit right. Something about her gaze, the way it slid away from his, felt wrong. For the first time, he wondered if there was something more going on. He knew he'd missed the banquet, but her coldness, her evasiveness, this was something else entirely. Driven by his suspicions, Michael began to watch her more closely. Elizabeth seemed distracted, spending an unusual amount of time on her phone, which she now guarded closely. Her work nights grew later. Her laughter during brief phone calls edged with something unfamiliar. Each new detail added weight to his suspicions. It wasn't until one Saturday afternoon, when he happened to glance at her phone on the counter as she showered, that he found the proof he'd been dreading. A message from her boss, Robert, flashed on the screen. "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again." Michael's heart twisted painfully. The implications were clear, but he fought the urge to react. Instead, he forced his expression to remain neutral, quietly setting the phone back down. He knew now that his suspicions were correct, but he also knew he'd need more evidence, proof that Elizabeth couldn't deny. From that day on, he moved with careful precision, methodically collecting information. He noted her weekends away, hired a private investigator to gather photos, and slowly built a case of undeniable betrayal. It was almost as if he'd become a ghost in his own marriage, watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to confront her. But instead of anger, a cold calm settled over him, a feeling that grew with every piece of evidence he amassed. With the evidence he needed in hand, Michael made plans for his next move. He contacted Elizabeth's parents, inviting them to lunch that Saturday, casually arranging the meeting at a place he knew Elizabeth and Robert frequented. When the day arrived, he maintained an air of casual conversation, discussing harmless topics over lunch as they waited for Elizabeth and Robert to show. Just as he'd anticipated, they arrived at the restaurant together, their hands touching as they exchanged a laugh. Michael's heart hardened, but he kept his expression neutral, guiding Elizabeth's parents' gaze in their direction. The moment they saw her, shock registered on their faces. Elizabeth, caught off guard, froze, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as she registered the sight of her parents. And Michael, his eyes cold and fixed on her. "What is this?" she managed to stammer, her face pale. "Oh, just a lunch with family," Michael replied smoothly, his voice devoid of warmth. "Though I imagine you were expecting something more private." Elizabeth's face drained of color, her gaze shifting to her parents, who stared back in disbelief and disappointment. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the full weight of what she had done. That evening, Michael waited in the living room, a neat stack of papers, the evidence he'd gathered, resting on the coffee table. When Elizabeth finally returned home, her steps hesitant and slow, he gestured to the seat across from him, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said quietly, motioning to the photos, the messages he'd collected, each one a clear betrayal. Elizabeth's eyes filled with dread as she looked at the incriminating evidence. but she attempted to hold her composure. "It was a mistake, Michael," she whispered. "I never meant for you to find out. It didn't mean anything." Michael's jaw clenched, but he remained calm. "You threw away 24 years of marriage, Elizabeth. You destroyed everything we built. For what? A fling?" Tears welled in her eyes, but he was unmoved. When you were furious with me for missing that banquet, I felt terrible. I regretted it. But now I realize that no matter what I did, you would have found a reason to push me away. You had already checked out of this marriage long before then." Elizabeth's face crumpled, her hands trembling. "Please, Michael, we can work through this. It was just a lapse in judgment." Michael shook his head, his voice steady. "A lapse in judgment?" He gestured to the photos and messages. "This is more than a lapse, Elizabeth. This is betrayal." She fell silent, her defenses shattered. He stood, gathering the divorce papers from the coffee table, and placed them before her. "I want you to leave. My lawyer will reach out on Monday," he said, his voice final. "The prenuptial agreement will leave you with exactly what you came into this marriage with. You've made your choices, and now you'll live with them." Elizabeth broke into sobs, pleading, but Michael's expression remained stony. His decision was made. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and brutal. Elizabeth's reputation, once respected, was tarnished by whispers of her affair. Her friends and family began to distance themselves, the story of her betrayal spreading quickly. Michael, meanwhile, felt a mix of relief and emptiness as he moved on, the satisfaction of his carefully planned revenge only slightly dulled by the loss of a life he'd once valued. In the end, he had given Elizabeth exactly what she wanted: freedom. But it had come at a price she hadn't anticipated, and as Michael walked away, he felt the weight of betrayal lift, leaving him ready to start anew, alone but liberated. Days after the confrontation, the house felt emptier than ever, despite Elizabeth's presence still lingering like a phantom. The silence between them was suffocating, punctuated only by the occasional exchange of harsh words. Michael maintained his usual calm demeanor, though inside, a storm was brewing. He couldn't forget the look in her eyes when he handed her the divorce papers. There was fear, but also something else, regret, perhaps. But for Michael, regret was too little, too late. The betrayal had cut deep, and his decision was final. Yet even as he felt vindicated, a gnawing emptiness remained. Revenge had been sweet, but it hadn't filled the void. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, who had once been so confident and self-assured, was unraveling. The fallout from her affair spread like wildfire, rumors poisoning her reputation at work, and whispers of her dishonesty followed her everywhere. Her once prominent position at the company was slipping through her fingers, the consequences of her actions catching up with her faster than she had anticipated. One evening, Michael came home to find her sitting in the living room, her eyes swollen from crying, her usually impeccable appearance disheveled. She looked at him with a mix of pleading and exhaustion. "Michael," her voice cracked. "Please, can we talk?" He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. "There's nothing left to talk about. Please don't say that," she implored, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm losing everything. I never thought it would end like this. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry. I want to fix this." Michael's heart hardened at her words. She wasn't sorry for him. She was sorry for herself. "You've lost your job," he said coldly. "Your reputation is in tatters. The world knows about your affair. But you never once considered the consequences for us. For this marriage." I know," she said, wiping away fresh tears. "But I'm asking for a chance to make it right. Please, Michael, don't throw everything away." Michael's eyes narrowed. "You had your chance, but now it's over." He walked past her, his back turned to her frantic pleas. He could hear her sobbing behind him, but he didn't turn around. He had to be strong. He had to hold his ground. The next few days passed in a blur. Michael's divorce lawyer was relentless, sending Elizabeth the paperwork to sign and making it clear that there was no negotiating the terms. Her prenuptial agreement, something she had once scoffed at, was now her greatest liability. At work, Elizabeth's downfall continued. Her affair with Robert had been exposed to her colleagues, and the once promising future she had envisioned with him now seemed like a distant, naive dream. Rumors circulated, and her reputation became the subject of gossip among those she had once considered friends. Her calls to Michael went unanswered, and when she did manage to catch him at home, he remained cold and distant. Then, one morning, Elizabeth arrived home unexpectedly, her face pale, her clothes wrinkled from what appeared to be a sleepless night. I don't know where to go," she whispered. "No one will speak to me. Not even Robert. He's ignoring my calls." Michael, who had been sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, looked up at her with an unreadable expression. "I don't know what you want from me, Elizabeth," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I can't help you now. You made your bed." "I never thought it would come to this," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think it would all fall apart so quickly." Michael stood up, tossing the paper aside. "That's the thing about betrayal, Elizabeth. You never see the consequences until it's too late." Michael's revenge was almost complete, but there was one final act left to execute. The lavish new TV he had bought, the one he had so carefully positioned in their living room, had been a symbolic gesture, but he knew he had one more chance to assert his control. He reached out to a mutual friend of Elizabeth's and Robert's, a woman named Barbara, who had been privy to Robert's philandering ways. With Barbara's help, Michael planned the ultimate humiliation, a staged accidental meeting between Elizabeth and Robert's wife. It took several weeks to arrange, but when the day arrived, it was everything Michael had hoped for. Elizabeth, with her fragile composure, arrived at a cafe where Robert's wife had been invited for a casual brunch. The setup was flawless. As Elizabeth walked in, her eyes widening in recognition, she found herself face to face with Robert's wife, who greeted her with a cold smile. "What a surprise," she said, her voice laced with thinly veiled contempt. "I didn't expect to run into you here." Elizabeth froze, her blood running cold as the realization hit. The woman didn't know about her affair with Robert. She knew about the affair and was now confronting her with it. As Michael watched from a nearby table, his heart pounded in his chest. He knew this moment would be the breaking point for Elizabeth. Her face drained of color, and her eyes flickered in panic. But there was nothing she could do now. The truth had been laid bare. Michael left the cafe before Elizabeth even noticed him. He didn't need to witness the fallout. He knew exactly what would happen next. Elizabeth's reputation would crumble even further. There was no escaping her actions now. A week later, Elizabeth moved out, leaving the house they had shared for so many years. Michael didn't watch her pack her things, nor did he stay for the tearful pleas that followed. He had already made up his mind. As he sat in the living room, staring at the oversized TV that now dominated the room, Michael reflected on everything that had led up to this point. Revenge had been sweet, but it hadn't filled the hole left by the betrayal. There was no satisfaction in her defeat, only a cold, hollow emptiness. The door clicked shut behind her as she left, taking with her the last remnants of their life together. Michael stood there, watching the door, unsure of what came next. But he knew one thing for certain: he was done. There was no turning back now. With a final glance at the empty space where their marriage once stood, Michael felt the weight of the past lift. For the first time in months, he could breathe again. The revenge was over. The consequences were hers to bear. The days following Elizabeth's departure were strange for Michael, both liberating and unsettling. The house, once filled with the hum of daily life and Elizabeth's voice, was eerily silent. Yet there was something cathartic in the quiet. The weight of betrayal that had clung to him for months was finally gone, though the relief was tempered by a sense of melancholy he hadn't anticipated. Elizabeth had packed up most of her things quickly, leaving behind only a few personal items scattered around. An old scarf draped over the back of a chair, her favorite perfume bottle abandoned on the bathroom counter. Michael didn't bother to collect these remnants. He let them stay where they were. The house felt cleaner somehow, purged of the dishonesty that had infected it. He even started to enjoy the freedom of making decisions without consulting anyone. But as the weeks passed, he began to wonder about the aftermath of his revenge. Elizabeth had left, but was she truly gone from his life? The emotional scars would take much longer to heal, And there was a part of Michael that still couldn't shake the image of her face when she realized everything had been laid bare. Work had become a distraction, a way to keep his mind occupied, but even that wasn't enough to drown out the questions that swirled in his head. Had he gone too far? Was he truly better off without her? Or had he simply been consumed by the need for retribution? One evening, as he was sitting at his desk, a knock at the door startled him. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly 9 p.m. He stood up confused. No one visited him this late. When he opened the door, his breath caught. There, standing on the doorstep, was Elizabeth. She looked different, broken, fragile, and smaller than he remembered. Her eyes were red from crying, her cheeks hollowed, as though the weight of her own regret had aged her. She held a small bag in her hand, her fingers nervously clutching the strap. "I didn't know where else to go," Elizabeth said quietly, her voice trembling. "Can I come in? Just for a minute?" Michael hesitated, the storm of emotions rising in him. But he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter, though he kept his distance. He hadn't seen her in weeks, and seeing her here, after everything, stirred up feelings he wasn't prepared to confront. She sat down on the couch without waiting for an invitation, her shoulders hunched in defeat. "I've lost everything, Michael. My job, my friends, my reputation. And now even Robert has abandoned me." Michael remained silent, studying her. The woman who had once stood so confident before him was now a shell of that person. He could see it clearly. Elizabeth had no one left to turn to. "I don't expect forgiveness," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need to say I'm sorry. I don't know how I could have been so blind, so selfish. I betrayed you in the worst possible way, and I can't undo it. But I need you to know that I'm sorry." Her words were like a dagger to Michael's heart. She was sorry, not for the damage she had caused him, but for the consequences she had to face. She was sorry because her own world had crumbled around her, not because she had destroyed his. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "You don't get to come here and play the victim, Elizabeth," he said, his voice colder than he intended. "You made your choices. You knew exactly what you were doing when you crossed that line with Robert. And now, you have to deal with the fallout. I'm done." Elizabeth flinched but didn't protest. Instead, she looked down at her hands, as though seeing them for the first time. "I never thought it would come to this," she said again, almost to herself. "I thought I could keep everything under control. But I didn't realize what I had until it was gone." Michael was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on her, a mix of anger and pity swirling inside him. He had gotten everything he'd set out to achieve, his revenge, her downfall, the exposure of her betrayal. But he still felt empty. This wasn't how he had imagined it would feel. "Are you happy now?" she asked, her voice suddenly strong, though her eyes betrayed her vulnerability. "Is this what you wanted? To see me lose everything? To watch me break?" Michael stared at her, feeling the weight of her question. Was he happy? He couldn't answer her. What was the point of all of it? What had it truly solved? He had taken pleasure in exposing her infidelity, in dismantling her life, but now, with her sitting there before him, broken, regretful, he wasn't so sure it had been worth it. "No," he said quietly, his voice softer than before. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to see you fall apart. I just wanted you to feel what I felt, to understand how it feels to be betrayed." Elizabeth met his gaze, her face a mask of regret. "I understand, and I'll live with that pain for the rest of my life." Michael swallowed hard, his throat tight. The anger that had driven him all these months began to dissolve, replaced by an emptiness he couldn't quite explain. The next few weeks were a blur. Elizabeth moved in with a friend, trying to rebuild the pieces of her life. Michael didn't see her again after that night. He threw himself into work, and slowly, the numbness he had felt began to subside. Eventually, the weight of his revenge no longer hung over him. Elizabeth had left, her reputation tarnished, her life in ruins, just as he had intended. But as the days turned into months, Michael realized that there was no satisfaction in watching someone else's misery. It was as if, in seeking justice for his betrayal, he had lost something far more important: his own peace of mind. He spent the next few months trying to reconcile with himself, trying to figure out what kind of person he had become. The need for revenge had consumed him, but in the end, it had only left him more isolated. And then, one day, he woke up, and the thought that had been creeping in for weeks became impossible to ignore. It was time to let go, time to move forward. Lauren sat across from Amanda in their favorite corner booth at the cafe, fingers lightly tracing the rim of her coffee cup as she stared into the dark liquid. Her thoughts swirled in patterns that mirrored the circles she traced, looping back to the same restless feeling that had taken root in her mind. Amanda was laughing about a story from her office, but Lauren's mind drifted, tugged by a quiet voice whispering that there had to be more. "All right," Amanda's voice cut through Lauren's haze, her friend's knowing gaze fixed on her. "What's going on with you?" Lauren gave a slight smile, a flicker of relief in her eyes. Amanda was one of the few people who could see through her carefully placed walls. She didn't have to pretend here. "It's just sometimes I feel like everything is just too steady," Lauren said, her words stumbling out with a hint of guilt. "Mark's amazing, really he is. We've been married for 7 years now. And he's everything I thought I wanted. But I keep asking myself if there should be more than this." "More?" Amanda raised an eyebrow, her interest visibly piqued. "You mean excitement? Adventure?" Lauren nodded, a slight flush warming her cheeks. She hadn't spoken these words out loud before, and somehow, saying them made them feel more real. "I guess it's like everything is perfect, yet so predictable." A slow smile spread across Amanda's face, her eyes sparking with mischief as she leaned closer. "Well, there are ways to shake things up. Have you ever thought about opening things up a bit? Giving yourselves space to explore?" Lauren blinked, taken aback by the suggestion. "Opening things up? You mean other people?" Amanda shrugged, her expression steady. "My husband and I talked about it, and honestly, it's given us a fresh start. A little freedom to explore what we want separate from each other. It doesn't have to mean anything serious. Just some room to breathe, you know? It's actually brought us closer." Lauren was quiet, her mind whirling as she took in Amanda's words. She felt her pulse quicken with a mix of shock and perhaps a tiny flicker of intrigue. "I don't even know how I'd bring that up with Mark," she murmured. "He'd think I've lost my mind." "Just be honest," Amanda encouraged, her voice gentle yet insistent. "It's not about him. It's about you needing something different. Tell him how much you love him and that you need a bit of freedom to feel alive again. If he's as good a guy as you say, he'll understand. He might even surprise you." Lauren took a deep breath, feeling a blend of nervousness and a strange thrill. Maybe Amanda was right. Maybe there was a way to rekindle the spark she had been longing for. But beneath that thrill, a small knot of worry began to form, a shadow she chose to ignore, telling herself that this was simply the beginning of a new chapter. That evening, Lauren sat across from Mark at the dinner table, her heart racing as she replayed Amanda's words in her head. Her fingers clutched her wine glass, her stomach fluttering with nerves. She knew she had to tread carefully. "Mark," she began, forcing a calmness in her voice that she didn't feel. He looked up, giving her his full attention, and his familiar, steady gaze made her heart ache. "Yes." She hesitated, her voice faltering. "There's something I've been thinking about lately. About us." Mark leaned in, a slight concern etched on his face. "Okay, I'm listening. I know this is going to sound strange, but I've been feeling a bit restless," she admitted, glancing away before her gaze flickered back to meet his. "Not because of you or anything you've done. It's me. I feel like there's a part of me that's missing something." Mark was silent, his expression unreadable, but he didn't interrupt. Encouraged, Lauren pressed on. "I guess," she continued, swallowing hard, "I've been wondering what it would be like if we gave each other a little freedom. Just some space to explore, to feel something different. It wouldn't change how I feel about you, Mark. I love you. I just think it might be good for both of us. Maybe we'd come out of it feeling even closer." There, she'd said it. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and strange. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of anger, confusion, anything that might reveal what he was thinking. But Mark's expression remained composed, almost too composed. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her feel exposed. "So, you want to open things up?" he asked, his voice calm measured. She nodded, her heart pounding. "Just for a while, just to see what it's like." Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He was silent for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "I see," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "If that's what you need, Lauren, I won't stand in your way." A wave of relief washed over her, yet a strange unease crept in alongside it. His reaction was so calm, so controlled. She'd expected some resistance, maybe even anger. But here he was, nodding in agreement, his eyes distant yet focused. He leaned forward, a faint edge in his voice. "But this freedom, this would go both ways, wouldn't it?" She felt a flicker of apprehension, but managed a nod. "Yes, of course, if that's what you want." Mark's gaze didn't waver, but his expression softened into a faint, unreadable smile. "I appreciate that," he said quietly. "If this is truly what you want, then let's see how it goes." His words lingered in the air, their simplicity masking something she couldn't quite grasp. The calmness that had once reassured her now left her unsettled, like she'd ventured into unknown waters without fully knowing how deep they ran. "Thank you, Mark," she whispered, a tentative smile crossing her lips. But as he returned her gaze, a feeling nagged at the back of her mind, a quiet, insistent voice warning her that she'd just set something irrevocable into motion. Lauren was still reeling from her conversation with Mark when she met Amanda a few days later. She told her about Mark's surprising acceptance, about the way he'd agreed without hesitation. "See? I told you he'd understand," Amanda said, her eyes gleaming with approval. "He's probably thrilled about it. Men like to act calm, but I'm sure he's excited too." "Maybe," Lauren replied, frowning as she sipped her coffee. "It's just he was so calm. Too calm. I keep wondering if he's really okay with it, or if he's just pretending." Amanda laughed, waving her hand dismissively. "You're overthinking it. He's a grown man. He'll be fine. Now, the important question is, when are you going to get started?" Lauren felt a mix of nerves and excitement ripple through her, a thrill that made her pulse quicken. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I feel like I can finally breathe." "Well then," Amanda grinned, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Why don't we start tonight? I know a place you'd love. Trust me, it's going to be unforgettable." A spark of excitement ignited within Lauren. For the first time, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Little did she know, the choice she was making tonight would lead her down a path far darker than she'd imagined, where Mark's quiet acceptance would reveal itself as something far more dangerous than she could foresee. The club pulsed with energy, and the air was thick with laughter, music, and the faint scent of perfume mingling with sweat. Lauren felt her senses come alive the moment she stepped inside with Amanda. It had been years since she'd been in a place like this, surrounded by people who moved freely, uninhibited, caught up in the night's thrill. Amanda flashed a wicked grin, her eyes scanning the room with practiced ease. "Let's grab drinks. I'll introduce you to some friends." Her tone was light, her movements confident, as if she belonged in this space. And tonight, she wanted Lauren to feel the same. They wove through the crowd, Lauren's heart racing as she let herself be led. Everything around her felt new, charged with excitement. Her nerves faded with each step deeper into the thumping, lively crowd. They reached the bar, and just as Amanda ordered 2 cocktails, a familiar face caught Lauren's eye. At first, she couldn't place him, but then it clicked. It was Charlie, a colleague from work, someone she'd only ever seen in the fluorescent-lit halls of their office building. Here, under the soft, shifting lights, he looked different. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hair tousled, a relaxed smile on his face that hinted at mischief. He noticed her and broke into a wide grin, walking over with a confidence she hadn't seen in him before. "Lauren, I didn't expect to see you here." She felt a thrill as he greeted her, something about this chance encounter sparking an unfamiliar excitement within her. She smiled, hoping her voice sounded casual, even as her pulse quickened. "Same goes for you. I didn't know you came to places like this." Charlie shrugged, a playful glint in his eyes. "I don't usually, but I think tonight might be a special night." He turned to Amanda, greeting her politely before focusing his attention back on Lauren. "Care to dance?" The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Lauren hesitated. But Amanda nudged her with a wink, mouthing, "Go for it." And so, she did. The music enveloped them as they moved on the dance floor, the bass pulsing through Lauren's body, grounding her in the moment. Charlie was close, his movements in sync with hers, his eyes never leaving her face. There was an unspoken connection, a tension that hadn't been there in the sterile office setting. Here it felt natural, almost inevitable. As they danced, Lauren felt the world around her fade. The music, the lights, the people, they all blurred into the background, leaving only her and Charlie. She felt his hand on her waist, his touch warm and steady, grounding her even as her thoughts spun. It was a sensation she hadn't felt in years, a pure, thrilling rush that made her feel alive. When the song ended, they stepped away from the crowded dance floor, finding a quieter corner near the bar. Charlie leaned in, his voice low, a hint of something more than friendship in his tone. "You're different tonight," he said, his eyes searching hers. Lauren felt a blush rise to her cheeks, her heart racing at his words. She didn't quite know what to say, so she simply smiled, her voice a soft murmur. "Maybe I'm just trying something new." Charlie chuckled, leaning in closer. "I like this side of you." The words settled over her, igniting a thrill that swept away the last of her reservations. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was something real, something electric. She felt herself leaning in, closing the distance between them, her heart pounding as she allowed herself to be caught up in the moment. And then their lips met, and the world tilted. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, fueled by a need neither of them had expected. Her hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself, and for a moment, she forgot everything. Mark, her marriage, her old life. In that instant, there was only Charlie and the thrill of breaking free. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Lauren found herself smiling, her cheeks flushed. She had crossed a line tonight, a line she couldn't uncross. But as she looked into Charlie's eyes, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Lauren woke the next morning with a strange mix of exhilaration and unease. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the night. The kiss, the music, the feeling of being someone new, someone free. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. But now, in the soft morning light, her thoughts drifted to Mark, to the calmness he'd shown when she'd broached the idea of an open marriage. She couldn't shake the memory of his reaction, the way he'd simply accepted her request, no questions asked. It had been too easy, too calm, as if he'd been expecting it. The thought stirred something uncomfortable within her, a feeling she pushed down as she forced herself out of bed. Mark was already up, his briefcase by the door, the faint aroma of coffee lingering in the air. She found him in the kitchen, his back to her, as he poured his second cup of coffee. He turned when he heard her footsteps, offering a warm smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady, almost cheerful. "How was your night?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't expected him to ask, especially not with that easy, relaxed tone. She felt a pang of guilt, but managed to smile. "It was good. Just a few drinks with Amanda." He nodded, his gaze steady on her. "Good to hear. You look like you had fun." His words were casual, but something in his tone made her feel exposed, as if he knew more than he was letting on. She looked away, her smile faltering. "Thanks. Are you heading into work?" "Yeah," he replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "Busy day ahead. I'll probably be working late tonight." Lauren felt a strange sense of relief at his words. It meant she'd have more time to sort out her feelings, to make sense of what she'd done. She forced a smile, her voice light. "Well, don't work too hard." Mark nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned to leave. As he walked out the door, she felt a nagging sense of unease settle over her, as if something unseen was lurking beneath his calm exterior. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just her own guilt. But deep down, a small voice whispered that Mark's calm acceptance might not be as innocent as it seemed. Over the next few weeks, Lauren's life transformed. She found herself texting Charlie almost daily, their conversations light and flirtatious, filled with a playful energy that left her smiling at her phone like a teenager. It was an escape, a thrill that lifted her spirits in a way she hadn't felt in years. But with each message, each secret meeting, the guilt gnawed at her. Every time she came home, she felt Mark's calm, steady presence as a weight, a reminder of the life she was slowly leaving behind. He never asked questions, never pried. Instead, he offered her a serene smile, as if he were truly happy to give her the freedom she'd asked for. And yet, there were moments when his calmness felt almost calculated, his quiet acceptance a mask she couldn't see behind. It made her uneasy, left her feeling as if she were waiting for something to happen, something she couldn't quite name. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Mark's voice broke the silence. "So, how's Amanda?" he asked, his tone casual as he took a sip of his wine. Lauren blinked, surprised by the question. She's fine." Mark nodded, setting his glass down. "I figured you two would be spending a lot of time together. She seems like a good influence on you." The words stung, a subtle edge to his tone that left her feeling exposed. She forced a smile, trying to keep her voice light. "Yes, she's been a good friend." Mark's gaze held hers, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad to hear that. I want you to be happy, Lauren. Truly." Something in his voice made her heart race, a strange sense of foreboding creeping over her. She managed to nod, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." But as the night wore on, that feeling of unease settled deeper, burrowing into her thoughts like a seed of doubt. She tried to push it away, telling herself that this was simply her own guilt, her own fears. Yet, in the back of her mind, the question lingered. Was Mark's calm acceptance really as simple as it seemed? Or was it the calm before a storm she couldn't yet see? Lauren's relationship with Charlie deepened over the following weeks, each encounter leaving her feeling more liberated, more exhilarated. They met in hidden spots, exchanging stolen glances and secret smiles, the thrill of it all intoxicating her. Charlie was charming, attentive in a way she hadn't realized she craved, and with every meeting, she felt herself slipping further into this new version of herself. But with the thrill came an undercurrent of guilt, a tension that resurfaced whenever she returned home. Mark remained calm, almost too calm, and every time she walked through the front door, his steady gaze would follow her, assessing, as if he were reading her mind. He didn't ask where she'd been, didn't probe in her nights out with Amanda, but his quiet acceptance began to feel like an unseen weight pressing down on her. One evening, she gathered her courage to address the growing distance between them. "Mark, how are you feeling about this arrangement?" He looked up from his work, a faint smile crossing his lips. "It seems to be making you happy, and that's what matters, right?" She hesitated, searching his face for any sign of resentment or bitterness, but all she found was his usual calm. I don't want this to hurt you." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Don't worry, Lauren. I have my own way of dealing with things." His words lingered in her mind, vague yet unsettling, and she couldn't shake the feeling that his calm was masking something darker. But as the weeks stretched on, she found herself distracted by the excitement of her new life with Charlie, even as Mark's quiet demeanor continued to haunt her. When Charlie invited her to a party one Saturday night, Lauren was both nervous and excited. The idea of a night with him, surrounded by new people in a private, secluded setting, was exactly the escape she needed. She told Mark she'd be spending the evening with Amanda, and he'd merely smiled, telling her to enjoy herself. The party was held at a large house on the outskirts of town, the rooms filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and music that pulsed through the walls. Charlie was waiting for her at the door, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. He took her hand, guiding her through the crowd, introducing her to friends who welcomed her with open arms. The energy in the room was electric, and Lauren felt herself swept up in it, letting her worries drift away as she leaned into the night's excitement. As the evening wore on, Charlie became more openly affectionate, his hand lingering on her waist, his gaze intense. They found a quieter corner, and he leaned in close, his voice low. I've been wanting this for a long time, you know? The words sent a thrill through her, and without thinking, she leaned in, letting the world blur around them as their lips met. It was a kiss filled with urgency, a need she hadn't felt in years, and for a moment, she forgot everything. Mark, her guilt, her carefully constructed life. There was only Charlie and the feeling of freedom he offered. But as the night wore on, the thrill began to wane, replaced by a nagging sense of unease. She found herself looking around the room, scanning the faces of strangers, feeling as though she were being watched. Shaking off the feeling, she tried to lose herself in the music, but the sense of unease remained, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. The next morning, Lauren woke in a haze, her mind filled with fragmented memories of the night before. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her actions settling over her. She'd crossed another line, one she couldn't undo, and for the first time, the thrill of it felt tainted. When she returned home, Mark was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, his expression as calm as ever. She braced herself for questions, an interrogation, maybe even a confrontation. But all he did was offer her a faint smile, setting his mug down with a quiet clink. "Have a good night?" he asked, his tone casual. Lauren's heart raced, and she forced herself to meet his gaze, searching for any hint of anger or resentment. But his eyes were calm, almost too calm, and she felt her stomach twist. "Yeah, just some drinks and dancing," she replied, her voice shaky. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. You deserve to have fun." She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on, that he was watching her with a silent knowledge that left her feeling exposed. But he didn't press her, didn't ask questions, and as the days passed, his silence became a presence of its own, heavy and suffocating. It was a week later when the first hint of Mark's plan surfaced. Lauren was going through her work emails when she noticed a strange look from one of her colleagues. She brushed it off, chalking it up to her own paranoia. But as the day wore on, more colleagues began to avoid her, their usual friendliness replaced by cold, polite distance. She tried to ignore it, but when her supervisor called her into his office, her heart sank. "Lauren," he began, his expression grim, "we've received some concerning information about your recent activities. There have been complaints about unprofessional conduct, and I'm afraid we're going to have to open an investigation." Her mind reeled as he laid out the details. Personal messages, photos, all things she thought had been private. She felt a wave of nausea as she realized that Mark must have been the one behind this, quietly collecting evidence, preparing to dismantle her life from the shadows. When she returned home that night, she found Mark sitting in the living room, his expression calm as ever. She wanted to scream, to confront him, but the cold detachment in his eyes stopped her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice breaking. He tilted his head, his gaze steady. "I'm just making sure you get what you wanted, Lauren. Freedom." The word hung between them, twisted and bitter, and she felt the full weight of his revenge settle over her. Over the next few weeks, Lauren's life crumbled. The investigation at work escalated. Her reputation shattered as more details emerged. Friends distanced themselves, and even Amanda, who had encouraged her to pursue her freedom, grew cold, her support disappearing when the consequences became too much to ignore. Her phone calls to Mark went unanswered, his presence in her life reduced to a formal wall of silence. She tried to reach him, to explain herself, but it was as if he'd vanished, leaving her alone to face the fallout. One morning, she found a note slipped under her door, a message from Mark's lawyer confirming their divorce proceedings. The words felt like a death sentence, a final blow to a life she destroyed with her own hands. She sank to the floor, the paper crumpled in her hand, her mind racing with memories of everything she'd thrown away. Desperate for closure, she finally managed to arrange a meeting with Mark. They met in a quiet, neutral setting, a small cafe where they'd once shared happy moments. But now, the warmth was gone, replaced by a chilling silence as they sat across from each other, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. "Mark, please," she began, her voice trembling. "I never meant for it to end this way. I thought this would bring us closer, somehow He looked at her, his expression unreadable, his calmness more unnerving than ever. "Lauren," he said quietly, "if you really believe that, then you were blind to the damage you were doing from the start. I loved you, trusted you. But when you brought up this idea of an open marriage, I knew something was already broken. So I just waited." Her heart twisted at his words, the finality in his tone cutting deeper than she'd expected. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I thought we could fix it somehow." He shook his head, a faint sadness in his eyes. "You didn't just make a mistake, Lauren. You broke our trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't come back. You wanted freedom, and now you have it. Enjoy it." He stood, leaving her alone in the cafe, his final words echoing in her mind. She'd gambled with everything she had, and now she was left with nothing. In the weeks that followed, Lauren was left to pick up the pieces. Her career was gone, her friends scattered, and her marriage reduced to a memory she couldn't escape. She spent her days in isolation, haunted by the choices she'd made and the life she'd lost. She often thought of Mark, of the calm, quiet revenge he'd enacted, a plan so meticulously executed that it left no room for redemption. She had gambled everything for a taste of freedom, and now, all she had was the hollow echo of her own mistakes. In the end, Lauren found herself truly alone, the weight of her choices pressing down on her with a relentless, unforgiving force. The life she'd once taken for granted was gone, leaving her to face a future shaped by the mistakes she could never undo.